Good morning. It is Thursday, August the 15th, and welcome to a supplementary episode of The Drill. Thank you very much. And this is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America today, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. So I had something I left off of my last broadcast or last episode that I wanted to include, and so I'm creating this supplementary episode to include it. It is there's a book, and it's called How We Got Here, and it's about the 1970s and its cultural effect on this country. And so it's the basic premise of the book is that the 1970s culturally was a pivot point in American cultural history. And I'm going to read the introduction to that book. I quote, "I prefer the dreams of the future to the history of the past," unquote. So Thomas Jefferson wrote to his friend John Adams in 1816. Could there be a more American sentence than that? The violence, poverty, and intolerance of the past was what Americans in Jefferson's day and ours had left their homelands to escape. The future was what they had intended to build here. Americans often mock Europeans for refusing to accept reality, for dreaming of the days when the British Navy ruled the waves, when the Kingdom of Poland stretched from Berlin to Kiev, when Rome was the capital of the world. Yet Americans have lived in their dreams every bit as much as Europeans, maybe even more so. When Charles Dickens visited the United States in the 1840s, he mocked the locals' habit of pointing at a wooden schoolhouse in a clearing and describing the great university that would soon arise from it, or of calling the muddy lanes of New York and Washington avenues and boulevards. But the locals were not lying. They were describing things not as they were, but as they must soon be. The magnificent future was not a speculation. It was, as one 19th century newspaper editor said, a sure thing that simply, quote, had not yet gone through the formality of taking place, unquote. That future has arrived. America, at the beginning of the 21st century, is rich beyond all reckoning. The communist superpower with which it grappled for half a century lies shattered at America's feet, begging for American aid, technology, and investment. Past wrongs are being righted. The descendants of slaves sit on corporate boards and command fleets and armies. The grandchildren of coolies scoop up scholarships and prizes. Women can go anywhere and do anything that men can. The United States leads the world in learning and the arts, in science and technology, in business and finance. Its shops are piled high with fresh plums in December and 100 varieties of ice cream in August. At the flick of a switch, Americans can listen to the Brandenburg concertos, played more finely than they ever were for the Elector of Brandenburg himself. With a flash of plastic, they can board a jet to Bali or Buenos Aires. With a tap of a key, they can order any book in print delivered to their doorstep the next morning. Do they want to know what is happening in Sierra Leone? They can see it live on CNN. Are they worried about their daughter on her first day of university? They can call her pager from their car phone. Are they sick or in pain? The world's most fantastic medicine makes even more fantastic advances with every passing week. And unlike any previous great power, unlike Victorian Britain, unlike the caliphs of Baghdad, unlike imperial Rome, Americans can see nobody and nothing on the horizon who would dare to take, who could even imagine taking all this away from them. In every way that we can count, tally, or measure, these are America's best days. It's high noon of empire. It's staggering to imagine what more Americans could wish for if they aren't satisfied with all they have. And yet, they aren't satisfied. In fact, it seems that they feel less content, less secure, less proud of their country than they did 40 years ago when Jim Crow still ruled the South, Soviet bombers were aimed at Manhattan, a heart attack meant certain death, and $20,000 a year was a handsome wage. In those grimmer days, American publishing houses ground out books warning the country against, of all things, complacency. Now, in an era where complacency seems like the most appropriate of all moods, the publishers are capitalizing on pessimism. On my bookshelf, I see The End of Affluence, Prozac Nation, The Time Bind, The War Against Parents, The Overworked American, and America, What Went Wrong. The publishers know their market, In all but 5 of the 35 years since 1965, a majority, often an overwhelming majority, of the American public has told pollsters that the country is on the, quote, wrong track, unquote. What matters, it turns out, are the things that cannot be tallied. Americans worry about deteriorating schools, about their inability to trust their neighbors, about the smut they see on television. They worry that the leaders ignore them and that their system is stacked against them. As then-Governor Bill Clinton said in his acceptance speech at the 1992 Democrat Convention in New York, quote, "Those who play by the rules and keep the faith have gotten the shaft, and those who cut corners and cut deals have been rewarded. People are working harder than ever, spending less time with their children, working nights and weekends at their jobs, instead of going to PTA and Little League or Scouts," unquote. Americans feel that the country has lost its moral bearings. As Senator Bob Dole declared in his acceptance speech in San Diego in 1996, quote, "Those who say that America has not been better, I say you're wrong. And I know because I was there. I've seen it. I remember," unquote. The wistful strains of nostalgia waft through American culture, from the revival of cigars, ballroom dancing, and retro cars and home appliances to the proliferation of new housing developments that attempt to evoke front porch, white picket small towns. Perhaps this yearning for old wisdom, old-fashioned, and old days is only to be expected in an aging country. In 1999, the median American was almost 37 years old. He, or more precisely she, since the average American is a woman, was 28 in 1970. Since World War II, the mood of the country has reflected the moods of the colossal baby boom generation. Rebellious when the boomers were teenagers, lustful when the boomers hit their 20s, covetous as they entered their 30s. Now, as they turn 50, the mood of the country is shading into melancholy, tinged with doubts and regrets of late middle age. Nevertheless, this yearning for the past springs from a deeper source than the aging of the baby boomers. Perhaps today's Americans, as they applaud the rhetoric of values, faith, and family, are disclosing something real and important about the present state of the American nation. It is often said that we live in a time of unusually rapid change. If we are referring to economic and technological change, this isn't true. A Rip Van Winkle who nodded off in 1930 and awoke in 1965 would have shut his eyes on a country where children were crippled by polio and adults died of strep throat, where workers walked or took the streetcar to their jobs in foundries and mines, on farms, or as domestic servants, where there were no federal old age or disability pensions, where news was transmitted by paper and ink and goods were paid for in cash. He would have opened them on a world transformed by television and cars, subdivisions and shopping malls, antibiotics and birth control pill, package tourism and universal high school education, fast food and credit cards. A Van Winkle who slept through the 35 years after 1965 would see hardly anything so dazzling compared to that. But if we're talking about social and cultural change, the pace since 1965 has been positively bewildering. A 1965 Van Winkle, familiar with long-distance telephones and DNA, would take the internet and dolly the cloned sheep in stride, but he would be left gasping by women bus drivers and the ubiquitous lottery ads, by the beggars on the sidewalks and the number of limousines on the streets, by the middle-aged men going to work in khaki pants and baseball caps, and the young women sleeping in military barracks, by the homoeroticism of magazine advertising and the proscription of smoking, by the collapse of trade unions and the spread of mutual funds, by the millions of children in daycare, the crumbling of the mainline Protestant churches, the automatic teller machines that offer service in both Spanish and English, and the replacement of beef by chicken as the staple of the American diet. In other words, the dizzying pace of change in the past 35 years has transformed not so much American tools as American habits, less Americans' material environment and more America's moral outlook. Less the way Americans make things and more the way they feel things. Have you ever seen a grown man cry? Before the 1970s, Americans agreed with Sir Walter Scott. Woe awaits a country when she sees the tears of bearded men, quote unquote. Back then, Americans idolized the craggy, inexpressive man, the sort of man epitomized by Charles Lindbergh and Gary Cooper, Neil Armstrong and Sergeant York, John Wayne and Anthony McAuliffe, the general who replied, "nuts," when surrounding Germans called on him to surrender at the Battle of Estaing. But the man has been melted by a vast shift. That man has been melted by a vast shift in the emotional climate, a kind of global moistening. The president wipes away tears when he tours hurricane disasters. Coaches' voices catch at their team's annual banquets. Fathers snuffle at their daughters' weddings. In 1972, the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for president, Senator Edwin Muskie, destroyed his hopes by appearing to break down and weep during a reply to an editorial attack upon his wife by a New Hampshire newspaper. Today, those tears would float Senator Muskie into the White House. Eaten any good meals recently? Not so long ago, American food was famously disgusting. Quote, tasteless roasts, banal beefsteaks, cremated chops, fish drenched in unintelligible sauces, greasy potatoes, and a long repertoire of vegetables with no more taste than baled shavings, unquote. So complained H.L. Mencken in the 1920s, and the complaint still held true in the middle 60s. 30 years ago, the United States was a country of whiskey drinkers and steak eaters. Today, you can find a good risotto in Minneapolis and a tasty vindaloo in San Diego. The national tipple is no longer bourbon, but Chardonnay. When was the last time you heard a politician denounce Wall Street? On the campaign trail in 1948, Harry Truman accused the Republicans of wanting to fasten a, quote, Wall Street economic dictatorship, unquote, on the country. People chuckled. That was the sort of thing that Democrats were expected to say. In those days, only the rich owned stocks or bonds, and the chief of the AFL-CIO was one of the half-dozen most powerful men in the country. The thought that a day might come when shareholders would outnumber union members almost 4-1, or that a Democratic candidate for president would cite a rising stock market as proof that his economic policies were working, as Bill Clinton repeatedly did in 1996, would have left old Harry gasping. It meant something when the Romans stopped wearing togas. It meant something when the French nobles stopped carrying swords. It meant something when Americans stopped spitting into cuspidors. Now it means something when you can buy a decaffeinated Sumatran coffee with steamed semi-skimmed milk and an almond biscotti on the ground floor of what used to be a discount woolens warehouse in the country that invented Nescafé. It means something that the assistant professors specializing in Marxist analysis of the films of Buster Keaton own 401k plans crammed full of General Electric stock. And it means something that Clint Eastwood felt obliged to weep on screen in The Line of Fire. We live in a world made new, and we made new not by new machines, but by new feelings, new thoughts, new manners, new ways. Yet for all our world's newness, there is a distinctly autumnal snap in the air these days. As the largest generation in American history prepares to exit the stage, the country finds itself examining its character. A people once collectivist, censorious, calculating, conformist, taciturn, obedient, puritanical, and self-confident has mutated in the space of 3.5 decades into a people that is individualist, permissive, emotional, enterprising, garrulous, rebellious, hedonistic, and guilt-ridden. Some of this change is for the better, some for the worse, but it is all puzzling and often uncomfortable. During the making of the movie Saving Private Ryan, the studio publicity department released a photograph of the star, Tom Hanks, clad in GI battle dress, talking face-to-face with the director, Steven Spielberg, wearing his trademark t-shirt and baseball cap. It was a wonderful image, the 90s meeting the 40s, and one found oneself glancing back and forth from the man dressed as a warrior to the man dressed as a 12-year-old, wondering, whither had the one man gone, and whence had the other man come? When did this change happen? How and why? The usual answer is a phrase that is explanation and date all rolled into one. Quote, the 60s, unquote. Many of us carry in our heads what might be called the documentary maker's version of that decade. As the birds sing, quote, turn, 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 unquote, the camera cuts from images of Martin Luther King Jr. on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to dogs fighting civil rights protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, thence to flower children in San Francisco, and then soldiers helicoptering down into a rice paddy, bombs dropping from the bay of a B-52, hippies smoking marijuana and flashing peace signs, Lyndon Johnson declaring he will not run again, tanks in the streets of Detroit, and finally, Kent State. The events these images represent, the war, the protests, the assassinations, are usually thought to be the events that made the America we know. The documentary maker's history is not entirely wrong, but it is not enough. Imagine telling somebody in 1969 that within 30 years welfare would have been abolished. Imagine trying to explain that baby boomer legislators would pass laws that permit the police to confiscate a car on the spot and without trial. If they discover the fragments of a joint in the ashtray. Okay, so let me try that again. Imagine trying to explain to baby boomer legislators would pass laws that permit the police to confiscate a car on the spot and without trial if they discover the fragments of a joint in the ashtray. Or that the first member of the Woodstock generation to become president would order more military interventions abroad than any president since FDR. The exciting political events of the years from John F. Kennedy's inauguration to the withdrawal from Indochina formed our time, yes, but not in the way we usually choose to imagine. The documentaries would have us remember the 60s as the era when the nation's young people took to the streets to protest the Vietnam War. But in fact, quote, almost every public opinion poll taken during the war showed that youth, in the aggregate, disproportionately supported the war. Surprisingly, the most dovish age group turned out to be people over 55, unquote. The candidate who drew his support most disproportionately from young men was not Robert Kennedy or Eugene McCarthy, but George Wallace. The documentaries described the 1960s as the decade in which the conscience of the nation was at last aroused against the evil of racial inequality. In fact, the crucial turn in public opinion occurred in the 50s. Up until the mid-60s, a plurality of white Americans believed that the country was moving not fast enough on civil rights. After the riots of the 1965, pluralities consistently insisted that the country was moving too fast. And despite all that footage of stoned young people rolling in the Woodstock mud, the 1960s were not the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Only 5% of Americans had ever tried marijuana by as late as 1967. A majority of American brides still said that they came to the altar as virgins in 1964. The number one song of 1969 was Sugar, Sugar by the Archies. When you think of the 1960s, it's a great mistake to imagine them as represented by, say, Hillary Rodham Clinton. 2/3 of the baby boomers never attended college. In 1966, almost all of the young men born in 1947, the year Hillary Clinton was born, were wearing their hair short, serving in the Army, or else taking jobs at the local plant, eating pork chops for dinner, and getting ready to marry the second girl they had ever slept with. The Berkeley free speech movement, the sit-ins at Columbia, the Harvard strike of 1969. For most American young people, the protests and love-ins of the 60s were as remote and alien as the Newport Regatta, the Deb balls in the Plaza Hotel, or the rituals of Skull and Bones. For older Americans, they were a good deal more exotic than that. An influential book published in 1970, The Real Majority, by Benjamin Wattenberg and Richard Scammon, observed that the typical American voter was neither young, nor poor, nor black. She was a 47-year-old machinist's wife living in Dayton, Ohio. And, as Wattenberg and Scammon did not quite say, as far as she was concerned, the 60s were the 40s, except that frozen vegetables had replaced canned. It was only in the next decade, the supposedly anticlimactic decade of the 70s, that her world and that of people like her was turned upside down, as Cambridge, Massachusetts, New Haven, Connecticut, Manhattan, and Northwest Washington were turned upside down by the 60s. It was in the next decade that her husband dumped her, that she discovered cappuccino, that her standard of living failed to rise for the first time in her adult life, and that she cast her first Republican ballot. The 60s, one-time Democratic activist Richard Goodwin later wrote, contained a promise, an augury of possibilities, an eruption of confident energy, unquote. They were a Promethean moment when everything seemed possible. The abolition of poverty, the overnight elimination of prejudice, unending economic expansion. But Goodwin is constrained to admit candidly that the 1960s were, quote, a failure, unquote. The liberal dreams of social reform with which the decade begat impossible hopes. The disappointment of those hopes spawned the radical movements of the decade's end, and the destructiveness and hatefulness of those radical movements in turn finished off liberalism's political prospects. Quote, this country's going so far right you're not going to be able to recognize it, unquote, predicted Attorney General John Mitchell in 1970. and at least from an electoral point of view, he was correct. The vast size of the United States, the intense conservatism of a country where ordinary people have much to lose, the traditional preference of Americans for individual rather than collective self-improvement. These things make it difficult for reformers and dreamers to make much of a dent in the American consciousness. Even with television to spread the word that they would ordinarily have been true for the 1960s too. But the spark of rebellion lit in the 60s did not sputter out, as previous sparks. The radical 1840s, for example, had done. This time, it caught. A political upheaval is transformed into an upheaval in habits, beliefs, and morals, and not the habits, beliefs, and morals of an elite few, but of 250 million souls spread across a vast continent. The origins of this upheaval can be traced far back in time, to the First World War, to the head-turning new ideas of Darwin, Nietzsche, and Freud, and arguably even further still. But incendiary ideas only move from paper to life when they transform the behavior and beliefs of the mass of the people, when they cease to be known as the work of their author and are absorbed instead as the common property of humanity. In North America, it was the supposedly quiescent 70s that this absorption took place. There were strange, feverish years, the 70s. They were a time of unease and despair, punctuated by disaster. The murder of athletes at the 1972 Olympic Games, desert Emirates cutting off America's oil, military humiliation in Indochina, criminals taking control of American streets, the dollar plunging into value, marriages collapsing, drugs for sale in every high school, a president toppled from office, the worst economic slump since the Great Depression, followed 4 years later by the second worst economic slump since the Depression. The U.S. government baffled as its diplomats are taken hostage, and in the background loomed still wilder and stranger alarms and panics. The Ice Age was returning. Killer bees were swarming up across the Rio Grande. The world was running out of natural resources. Kohoutek's comet was hurtling toward the planet. Epidemic swine flu would carry off millions of elderly people. Karen Silkworth had been murdered for trying to warn us that nuclear reactors were poisoning the Earth. General Motors was suppressing the patent on a hyper-efficient engine. Food shortages would force soon Americans to subsist on algae. There were, wrote a columnist for the New York Times, quote, fleeting moments when the public scene recalls the Weimar Republic of 1932 and 1933, unquote. Disasters, though, can be liberating as well as destructive. In the 1970s, the giant corporations that had dominated the American economy since the 1890s began to shrink. Trade unions lost their power. The personal computer was invented. It became legal to ship a crate of lettuce across the country without asking the Interstate Commerce Commission for permission. In the 1970s, the federal government lost its power to wiretap at will. Conscription was suspended. Price controls were discredited and repealed. Before 1970, America was a love-it-or-leave-it society. You didn't like Chevrolets? Tough. Your kid was homesick and wanted to watch a cartoon at 10 on a weekday morning? Also tough. You wanted a checking account that paid interest? Again, tough. You needed to pay less than $900 for an economy ticket to Paris? Tough once more. You'd like to own some gold coins? Fella, that's a very serious crime in these United States. The gaudy characters of the 1960s are already seeping out of memory. In the gallery of forgotten celebrities, Abby Hoffman is joining General Coxey. George Romney jostles against William McAdoo. Timothy Leary will soon vie for space with Madame Blavatsky. But the social transformation of the 70s was real and permanent. It left behind a country that was more dynamic, more competitive, more tolerant, less deferential, less self-confident, less united, more socially equal, less economically equal, more expressive, more risk-averse, more sexual, less literate, less polite, less reticent. But those are just words, aren't they? To really understand how the country has changed, we must study it minutely. This book is an attempt to do just that, to describe the most total social transformation that the United States has lived through since the coming of industrialism, a transformation, a revolution that has not yet ended, to describe and to judge. So that is the introduction to How We Got Here, which is an examination of the 1970s as a pivotal point in American cultural history, and that is going to be my supplemental episode of The Drill. And I thank you for listening, and until next time, have a great day.